and welcome to another episode of Boundless Body Radio. I am your host, Casey Ruff, and I am super excited for this one. Before we introduce our guest, I'm going to introduce our co-host, the lovely Bethany Ruff. Bethany, welcome back.
Hello, hello.
I am very excited and very happy to sit back on this one and learn from the two of you, movement masters. So let's get rolling.
Oh man, I'm just trying to keep up. Okay, we are so excited. We have a very special guest today, one of the most innovative minds in human movement and the founder of Advanced Human Performance, Dr. Joel Seedman. With over 15 years of personal and team training, strength coaching, and nutritional counseling experience, Dr. Joel Seedman works with a spectrum of clients ranging from amateurs to professional athletes. Dr. Seedman takes a holistic approach to training, incorporating the best of neuromuscular physiology, motor learning, exercise physiology, sports nutrition, biomechanics, and functional anatomy to aid his clients. In addition to working with clients, his research in the realm of exercise science has been featured in many well-known national publications, making him a vital role in the world of human movement. We're so honored to get the chance to pick his brain and ask some questions today. Welcome to the show, Dr. Joel Seedman.
Thanks for having me. That's a pretty big intro there. I'm feeling a little pressure to live up to the hype.
You have quite a few acronyms after your last name. That is for sure.
Oh, nice. Nice. Well, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So I'd like to dive right in. How did you come to fall in love with fitness? What was the pivotal starting point for you?
Yeah, I would say as early on as 14 or 15, because I actually had scoliosis when I was a young kid, just from doing so many sports, single, kind of that single side dominant, from a lot of tennis to, baseball. And I don't, there's probably some genetic stuff in there as well. But I realized early on, I had to start doing something to help with that. So I started doing strength training when I was young, when I was 14, 15, going into high school. And then just kind of got a passion for it, started helping some of my friends, and just started really kind of diving into what all that I could get my hands on, which was pretty much at that time just muscle and fitness magazines and flex magazines and all the Weider publications that are kind of the hardcore bodybuilding approach to things. But it developed a passion for me, and then really at about 17 or 18, I realized that, hey, I wanted to actually pursue this as something that I did full time, because I realized how important training was, not just for physique and appearance, but for overall health and performance and just quality of living. And so I decided to, pretty much do all my schooling in that. So my undergrad and, master's, I did kinesiology at Indiana University, and then I did my PhD in exercise science as well at the University of Georgia. So it's pretty much been something that for, really the last 20 plus years of my life, I'm 35 now. So it's been just something that has been a driving force for me and something that I've been very passionate about.
That's super awesome. So with the scoliosis, it's interesting background. Does that have any kind of play into why you do anti-rotation training with a lot of your clients now?
Yeah, I definitely had to do a lot of stuff to help with my back, and my spine, and I still do, because once you have scoliosis, unless you had one of the treatments where they give you the brace, and they give you the different type of manipulation therapy, which I never had. And even then, oftentimes that doesn't fully correct it. So that the training definitely helped. It's still there. You can't really notice it, but my spine is incredibly sensitive. And if I do things wrong or off, or go a little too crazy with the weight, just even slightly, I definitely pay the price for it. So, I have a lot of clients that I've worked with over the years that have had quite a few spine issues and low back issues, and just a lot of injuries. People coming to me who maybe they sought treatment from many other sources and they couldn't quite fix the problem. So I do a lot of what I like to call kind of neuromuscular troubleshooting. So the rotation training, or the anti-rotation training, and just core strength in general is a huge part of that, to make sure that the spine is healthy and that the muscles around the spine are doing their job, so that the person can basically continue to do all the movements they want to, and including heavy strength training if that's their goal.
That's super awesome. And I can definitely relate. I'm a Pilates instructor myself, so I definitely see my fair share of spinal misalignments. What are the most common spinal misalignments or pelvic instabilities that you see with your clients?
Yeah, I would say probably just overall lack of posture awareness. There's so many different deviations in spinal integrity that we can see and that we can observe. But I think when it comes down to it, a lot of folks, they actually are able to address it pretty well and correct it as long as they understand what they have to do, and they start to have mindfulness and that kinesthetic awareness of what their posture is supposed to feel like, how it's supposed to set during their movements, and how it's supposed to feel throughout the day. So I think, elevated shoulders, shoulder rounding, forward head tilt, lordotic posture or excessive curvature of the lower spine, and, obviously the anterior pelvic tilt. So I think a lot of that just comes back to overall, imbalances throughout the body, whether we're talking, lack of hip strength, lack of core strength, over dominance maybe in their hip flexors, or just sitting too much. There's so many things in society now that just play into this. It's never just a simple answer or simple reason why it occurred, but oftentimes the solution is maybe not quite as complex. It's just a matter of having the person do basic forms of training and doing it right, and strengthening the muscles that surround their spine and their hips. And oftentimes that is the great kind of solution for these problems.
I see a lot of the same. You were actually one of the first people. I've followed you on Instagram for the last couple of years, and I think your stuff's just awesome. Brutal, but awesome. And I saw that you do a lot of barefoot training, and I noticed the specific type of like barefoot looking shoe. And actually about 6 months ago, I kind of decided to take the leap and get my feet out of the foot prisons they were living in, cushioned running shoes, and switched over to barefoot training. And I have noticed crazy changes. Can you talk to me a little bit about the importance of the structure of the feet and what you coach?
Oh, I love what you said. The foot prisons. That's really what they are. These foot traps, and it's almost like a modified form of foot binding, like they used to do back in Asia hundreds of years ago. And the normal shoe, the traditional shoe, it is not designed to optimize foot and ankle function or foot health or performance for the human body. It's designed to look cool, and that's it. So really, when we look at traditional shoes, most of them, not only do they not help us improve our foot and ankle function, but they actually degrade our foot and ankle function for a few reasons. First off, the toe box is often so narrow that it crams our feet together, and that toe spacing, or that splaying of the toes, as we like to call it, and being able to move them around, that's so critical because we have so many nerve signals and basically sensory receptors in our feet and in our ankles and in our toes, and it gives us so much sensory feedback. And there's so many muscles down there, and activation begins with the feet and ankles, and it really impacts everything up the kinetic chain. And if the feet and ankles aren't doing their job properly, it really has a negative impact all the way up. We're not just talking about, oh, the feet just aren't doing their job. No, it impacts our thighs, it impacts our hips, it impacts our core. It can even impact our upper body posture and into our shoulder and neck. And it's pretty crazy to see. And then, you look at a lot of these normal shoes or these traditional shoes, and you have the elevated heel. So the heel is typically elevated, an inch or so more than the front of the foot. And what that does is it changes your center of mass or your center of gravity. So you're always being pushed forward into your toes more, instead of having your center of mass going straight down and straight through into your hips. So, it only looks like an inch, but it's exponentially greater as you work your way up the kinetic chain. And doing that for hours a day, standing in those positions and having that kind of, biomechanical compromised position constantly, it, like you said, it definitely alters your performance. So switching that barefoot shoe, I think that's huge for so many athletes. Couldn't recommend that more.
I absolutely agree. I notice so many in the work that I do as far as structural integration, so many everted or turned out feet that kind of coincide with that anterior pelvic tilt, forward rounded shoulders, forward head. And I find that people almost have no ability to separate or press down through their big toe joint, which kind of shuts off the entire midline of the body. So the entire core has no shot at working. Do you kind of find the same thing?
Totally. That big toe is so important. I'm always, trying to tell my clients and telling them, hey, you got to get that big toe firing. First off, we got to make sure it's not crammed and smashed into the other toes. We got to get some separation. So whether they have to, manually take their fingers when they're at home and just work on that, or if they have to wear toe spacers, or some of them, if it hasn't gone too far, they can control it neuromuscularly, where they can actually say, hey, I'm going to fire my feet and try and spread the big toes without having to use my hands or an external, tool or instrument to pull them back in a position. But once they know how to spread them, then we have to get them to fire and press into the floor. And that signaling in the big toe is so huge. If it's almost as if someone can't fire the big toe well, and they can't fire their feet properly, you almost can't do any exercise correctly, particularly anything that's standing based. So, we talk about sports performance. Your every aspect of your athletic performance and body movement is off because your feet aren't doing their job. So no, I think you nailed it. And then it plays into all these other compensation patterns from the, external rotation of the feet and hips, which, impacts our core activation, impacts our alignment, alters our posture, our head position. It's pretty crazy. And it's always wild to see how something so small can impact so many things on such a huge level. It's like a puzzle, right? You mess with one piece and it kind of throws off the entire thing. And then you get that one piece back into its right position. And guess what? Everything else kind of follows suit. So it's pretty cool to see. The human body is a pretty cool masterpiece, right?
Oh, it's so fascinating. Before we move on from feet, I definitely know that I work with a handful of clients that have been either told by somebody in a white lab coat or have self-diagnosed or maybe used Dr. Google to figure out that their feet are flat or they have a high arch or maybe they're over supinating and they're working with orthotics or arch supports. Is that something that in beginning training sessions you have them take out, even if they are starting at that position?
I do. Well, let's put it like this. I have them take the arch support out and the orthotics and even their shoes for the most part when they're doing the training exercises, such as, strength training, the barefoot squats, the barefoot hinges, the split squats, the balancing exercises. Now, obviously, it depends on the individual case, but there are certain folks that their bodies aren't ready to totally graduate to barefoot or barefoot shoe or more minimalist shoe right away, at least. And we kind of have to ease them into that. And I think this is one of the problems that we saw with the barefoot industry. The barefoot training idea really started to become huge about, I would say, almost a decade and a half ago when we started to see the first Vibram five-fingered shoes, and everyone was like, "What the heck are these shoes?" So what happened was it became very trendy because the science suggested, "Hey, the feet are really important. We need to do more barefoot training," and the science was right, and the general idea that the fitness industry was promoting was right. The problem was how they implemented it and the preparedness of the individuals who are trying to use this approach. Everyone's been used to wearing normal cushioned traditional shoes their whole lives, and they have very poor foot and ankle strength. And then you throw them into these extreme barefoot scenarios where they're running a few miles every day barefoot. Well, that's an industry. That's an injury waiting to happen, and it could be absolutely devastating. And so we have to ease them into it. But I do find when it comes to just the traditional strength training and activation exercises for their feet, most people do not need the orthotics or the normal shoe. They can go barefoot. But when they do things like their cardio or their walking or jogging or maybe daily living, they may have to gradually progress to taking the orthotics out eventually, then going to a slightly less cushioned shoe, then to maybe a slightly more supportive barefoot shoe, and then they can get to an even more minimalist shoe, and then it's kind of up to them at that point how minimalist they want to go. So it's definitely something that has to be done very gradual to make sure that injuries don't happen.
I love that. Thanks for touching on that. I think, yeah, as long as people are being super mindful with that impact training, that is a great point. Let's talk a little bit about, you've coined the eccentric isometric protocol. Can you explain that, how that came to be, and how you use that with your clients?
Yeah, this is definitely one of the more, at least to me, and I think most people when they start looking at this, it tends to be one of the more fascinating and complex areas of performance, at least how I look at it. As we know, biomechanics and our muscle activation patterns are critical because that determines our, movement efficiency, and that really determines our, our level of function and how healthy our joints are and how our muscles fire, and it determines how well we're moving our biomechanics. And as we know from the research, that actually has a massive impact on our entire physiology because it actually has a pretty big say-so on whether or not we're harboring all this inflammation in our body. So what they're finding is that inflammation, which is very largely responsible for a lot of diseases, can actually be traced back to our muscle function. Not 100%, but our muscle function does play a very big role in how much inflammation is in our body. Because if we think about it, a muscle is such a large portion of our human body, and it's now reclassified as an endocrine organ or an endocrine tissue. And endocrine organs, they crosstalk to all other organs of the human body. So if our muscles, the largest endocrine organ of the body, if they're not healthy, if they're not doing their job, it has a negative impact on our entire health, our entire physiology. If they are healthy, it has an incredible impact on everything, and our bodies function better. We're not prone to injury. We're not harboring all this inflammation, our hormones, the way, all of our biochemistry is happening. It has a massive impact on that. So it's not just what we see at the external level. It's what's happening at the cellular level, at the intramuscular level. It's very deep. And so I realized early on when I was doing my research that biomechanics was huge. Okay. So at that point, how do we first off get people to have, proper form? And first off, and even before that, what is proper form? How do we constitute what optimal muscle function is? And so that's kind of a deep, story there too. And it can get pretty complex, but generally speaking, if we look at how the human body functions and what is optimal biomechanically and neuromuscularly, we find that these 90-degree angles are kind of optimal for the human body when we're talking about how we move. Now, obviously our body has to be able to get into extreme scenarios and extreme positions occasionally, but in terms of therapeutic training that is going to optimize how our body feels, it's going to optimize our ability to perform at the highest level, pain-free, injury-free. Those 90-degree positions are huge. And the eccentric isometric principle, what it's essentially for is to help the person find these optimal positions and hone in on them so that they can basically master their movement, so that movement starts to trickle into all other aspects of life, and they have enhanced proprioception and kinesthetic awareness. And the eccentric isometric principle, all that is basically you're doing a very controlled and systematic eccentric motion. And then once you get to the 90-degree position, you're holding that. You're not just mindlessly holding that like a lot of people think, where it's just holding for the sake of getting more time under tension. What you're doing is you're actually co-contracting your muscles, your agonist and your antagonist, to create this maximal tension at these 90-degree angles before you concentrically drive back into the starting position. So what those 90-degree positions do is we find that they also help to optimize proprioception and kinesthetic awareness and sensory feedback. So basically our sense of feel is optimized in those positions, not to mention we have the most muscle activation and it's the easiest position on the joints. So the eccentric isometrics, that's pretty much what it comes down to. It's to optimize muscle function. That, from what I found, it's the most effective way that I can find to make that happen.
That is a fantastic description. Thank you so much. As far as that eccentric isometric protocol goes, since you are performing a slower, let's say on a squat, slower on the way down with the hold at the bottom, that would obviously impact the amount of weight that you'd use and the amount of sets that you would potentially do. Is that correct? Or is there kind of a standard you use?
No, 100%. And that's the thing that we're finding. And actually, it's funny because everything that I'm saying, and I get, some haters on the social media, which I think everyone does these days. But, people are always saying that, you can't do these because you got to go so light. Lightweight's not going to do anything for you, and everyone's all about going heavy, getting bigger, getting stronger. And in reality, our muscles don't really know what the load is. They know intensity. They know the intensity of the intramuscular stimulus as far as the load on the bar, the load that you're handling. It really doesn't know. So if we can take a lighter weight and use proper form and create high levels of muscle tension, that's where our body responds to. And bodybuilders have been saying this for years. This is nothing new. And this is what I was saying with, people hating. It's like, hey, I'm not really saying anything new. I'm just trying to summarize it. And a lot of lifters, a lot of proficient lifters and people who have been in this industry for a long time realize that you don't have to put a ton of weight on the bar to create, progress. Oftentimes, using a lighter weight, honing in on the form, creating that high level of muscle tension and optimizing our biomechanics, that produces a great stimulus, not just to, get you stronger and improve performance, but even for, basically a growing muscle and for the hypertrophy benefit. So you definitely do have to reduce the weight. However, the cool thing about eccentric isometrics is because you're improving neuromuscular efficiency so much and you're basically improving and enhancing your biomechanics, that when you do want to go heavy, when you do really want to push the weight, you're far more capable of doing that than when you weren't training with eccentric isometrics. So it's pretty cool because it prepares you to be able to handle almost whatever scenario you throw at your body because you're maximizing what your body is prepared to handle. So yes, with training, you're going to have to reduce the weight a little bit, especially at first, but ultimately because you're producing and stimulating so much strength gains and hypertrophy gains, you're actually going to be able to handle heavier weights in the long run, and you're going to be able to do that in a safer fashion. Not to mention, you're going to stay injury free because you're having such good technique, which, as we know, staying injury free is that's the name of the game. It's the long game. It's not the short term game where you try and put maximal weight on the bar the first few months, and then you run into injuries and have all these setbacks. So no, that's definitely key. Though is using the appropriate weights that you achieve the optimal stimulus.
Yeah, I think that's so cool. I see so many people, really focusing on pushing the weight up, but they don't really focus on, holding or lowering the weight down with intention. So I agree. I think that's super important. Very cool.
I think the concentric people worry so much about, the weight they're lifting, the weight they're pressing up, the weight they're squatting up. The eccentric, like you said, the research is pretty clear. It's actually more important than the concentric. And if you go slow and controlled and really maximize that eccentric stimulus, that's really where a lot of our gains are coming from, not just for muscle and strength, but also for injury prevention. So yeah, the eccentric is huge.
That's awesome. I love that. Thank you for that explanation. Let's take a quick break and we'll come back here in about 30 seconds.
All right, we're going to dive right back in with another question for you. How long is a typical workout session for your more advanced clients, or maybe for yourself? Are you hitting X amount of number of exercises or stations? Are you taking any kind of specific rest in between?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So typically, just from a logistics standpoint, as a trainer, they're generally speaking about an hour. However, the time slot, the amount of time, I'm not as worried about that as I am the movements and making sure that we hit all the primary movements with the appropriate number of sets and the optimal rest, obviously. And that usually ends up being around 7 exercises. I usually like to try and target what I would consider the big 7, which would be the squat, the hinge, and the lunge, and then the 4 for the upper body, which would be the horizontal push and pull and the vertical push and pull. And then we'll usually throw in a few accessory things such as core exercises or some foot and ankle drills, but sometimes those movements can actually be worked in conjunction with the big 7. So you could be doing something like a eccentric isometric single leg squat, and guess what? That's your foot and ankle exercise of the day, not to mention you're hitting your squat pattern. Or you could be doing something like a renegade row, which is obviously working your back, but it could also be your core exercise for the day. So typically I like to try to make sure we get those big 7 with the eccentric isometrics while simultaneously getting into the core and the feet and the hips and any other weakness that the client may have. And oftentimes for athletes too, I do like to try and include one explosive movement or one power movement every workout, just to make sure they're really activating those fast twitch fibers.
It sounds like they get a lot of bang for their buck in that hour. What's your personal favorite exercise and why?
Ooh, personal favorite. I would have to go with the overhead lunge or overhead split squat or overhead Bulgarian squat, because I feel like it's probably one of the most effective things that you can do just to target all the muscles of the body as well as kind of elongate everything. So if you're tight or you've been sitting all day, or if your low back is stiff, you got some tightness in your hips, or if there's something off with your anywhere in the kinetic chain, that overhead lunge or overhead split squat position literally kind of gets to everything. It's almost the catch-all for every muscle in your body, from your head and neck all the way down to your feet, and you can really feel that whole kind of elongation through the fascia line that runs from your feet and hips all the way up into your shoulders, and you feel kind of this nice natural elongation of the spine. And a lot of people walk away from those when they do the eccentric isometrics with good form on those overhead lunges and overhead split squats. They'll feel like they kind of had a natural chiropractic adjustment. So I just had to choose one exercise that I personally love and that just feels so good and just feels like it's so therapeutic, but at the same time builds a lot of functional strength and stability and motor control. I can't beat that one.
My core is shaking just thinking about that. So
Nice.
speaking of fascia, that is speaking my language. Do you, just out of interest, do you do any researching with anatomy trains, or are you familiar with Tom Meyer?
Yeah, I've done a little bit, just enough to know how important, targeting all the muscles of the body and making sure that you're kind of hitting all those movement patterns and just all the different kind of muscles as you're doing the different exercises, and that everything is in proper alignment because everything impacts everything essentially. Even the smallest thing in the human body, like we talked about earlier with the feet, can impact the entire kinetic chain. And you got those oblique slings and the posterior oblique slings, the anterior ones, all those muscles that kind of cross from one hip into the core to the opposite shoulder, and it's pretty cool to see. But yeah, no, I think that's a big thing, and it kind of goes back into the rotational training and seeing those muscles work too. But yeah, no, the oblique slings are big, and the fascia lines, like you said.
I think I first saw and learned about what reactive neuromuscular training was from your Instagram page a few years ago. What can you kind of explain what that is and how you utilize that?
Yeah, no, definitely. So I think probably the most obvious example of that is just looking at someone who maybe has ankle pronation or valgus ankle collapse, where their knee and their ankle kind of caves inward. And it's something we obviously want to avoid. It can lead to some knee issues and hip issues and low back. So one of the most simple things that you can do is, if the person is falling inward and their ankle collapses or knee collapses, is you actually do something it's called feeding dysfunction, okay, or trying to move into that dysfunction. So what they have to do is you push on them even more so in the direction that they're wanting to collapse into, which would be inward in this case, and they have to resist even more to resist, so that they don't fall in, essentially. So they almost have to push out, and they have to essentially resist more pronation than normal. So it teaches them to create tension to the outside of their foot. So you basically push them to the direction that they want to fall. They have to resist that by pushing to the opposite direction, which essentially helps to eliminate the type of dysfunction they have, and it starts to correct it. You can do that with bands. You can do that with manual tension. You can do that with a lot of different kind of modalities, but essentially what you're doing is, whatever area that they have a tendency to fall into, you want to push them even harder into that dysfunction, and it helps them to resist that.
You talk quite a bit about the importance of walking as well. Can you highlight why you think that's so important?
Of walking.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think humans are meant to move. Humans are meant to walk. We just don't move like we used to. Everybody's so sedentary, and it's great that everybody, not everybody, but fitness enthusiasts get to the gym. But for the most part, they're sitting throughout the day constantly. They're not getting up, moving around, and the walking. If people walk 30 minutes a day, I think the level of obesity would drop so significantly. And not to mention, it just would make everyone feel a lot better instead of just sitting for hours and hours on end. I like to tell my clients, if you're sitting a lot throughout the day, every hour or so, get up, walk around for 2 to 3 minutes, maybe even do like a few postural exercises or a single leg stand to kind of fire up some of those muscles in the kinetic chain. And that way, when you go back to sitting, you're not going to feel so stiff. So I think the walking's huge. I try to accumulate at least 30 minutes of walking every day, and that does not count as my workout. That's just general physical activity that we as humans should be getting more of.
I love that. I used to do metabolic testing, and we would show people where they were most effective burning fat. And many people were surprised to learn that walking is actually more beneficial for them than, say, running, as far as burning actual fat calories versus just burning a bunch of total calories. So I love that.
Oh yeah, no. And it also too, it keeps your metabolism going throughout the day, where you have these little mini spikes and mini, peaks and valleys, instead of having this just low baseline level where your metabolism is running low, and then, okay, you spike it during your workout, and then you go back to sitting and it can kind of stay low. So just walking a few times throughout the day, a few minutes here and there, it can do wonders, not just for health, but for, body composition.
It's great.
What do you believe is the biggest misconception or misunderstanding in the world of exercise, health, movement, nutrition? And you can kind of take it anywhere.
Ooh, interesting. So it can be anything. It doesn't have to be nutrition. It could be strength training, anything.
Anything.
Okay. I'm going to say that it deals with range of motion. And the biggest misconception I see is that maximal range of motion is optimal range of motion. And I couldn't disagree more with that. And it's not just my opinion, to be honest. I think there's a lot of research to support that. I think optimal range of motion is rarely maximal range of motion. And that when we try to push our mobility boundaries too much, we end up running into issues. It's something that is become kind of trendy in the fitness industry to go for these huge movements and this exaggerated range of motion and this, massive amount of mobility and flexibility. And then you got to ask yourself, like, well, where does that end? Like, are we just going to keep stretching the person and gaining more and more mobility until they can, wrap their leg around their head? And where does that stop? There has to be a point somewhere. And like everything with physiology, there's always an optimal balance. And everything in physiology, we don't want too much, we don't want too little, we want the optimal. And that's for chemistry, that's for hormones, that's for muscle function, that's for, structural physiology, neurophysiology. If we go too extreme one direction, we pay the consequences. And I think we are definitely seeing that. A lot of people who have been lifting for years, trying to push their mobility boundaries, whether that's on squats or whatever exercise it may be, they've actually ruined their mobility because they have so much inflammation and they've destroyed their joints and their cartilage and connective tissue so much that they actually can't move well. And when they actually do need to get in those extreme positions, when occasionally is required of them, they can't do it because they're so stiff, so tight, so inflamed, their joints are so shot. So training through those natural ranges of motion, which I like to go back to the 90-degree angles, it prepares your body so that it can handle anything when it needs it. And usually that's 90-degree angles when we're in everyday life and on the field. But when we need those more extreme positions, because our muscles and our joints and our body is healthy, we can get in those positions more easily.
I love that. Do you recommend to your clients or utilize for yourself yoga, Pilates, any kind of stretching protocol, or does everything happen in the weight room for you?
So I'm not opposed to yoga or Pilates as long as it's done properly, and it's not with an excessive range of motion. Unfortunately, I think the yoga industry, and I think a lot of yoga instructors are starting to see is it got a little extreme there where they were starting to push like everyone needed to do these massive stretches and these kind of contortionistic positions. So for me, I'm not really anti anything in terms of the type of movement as long as it's done within the optimal boundaries of what's ideal physiologically and biomechanically speaking. When we start to wander out and deviate from those parameters, then we start running into issues, whether that's Pilates, whether that's strength training, whether that's yoga, whether that's Olympic weightlifting. We have to be careful. So I'm not really opposed to any form of movement as long as it's done properly. But for my clients, generally speaking, they seem to get most of the benefits in the weight room. And I kind of leave that up to them. If they want to do some extra stuff, they can, but proper movement is very therapeutic. So when you move correctly, and it doesn't necessarily require corrective exercise, it just requires correct exercise. And when they do that, they reap all the therapeutic benefits, and they oftentimes don't feel like they have to do a lot of stretches or soft tissue work or foam rolling, and they feel healthy and their body is ready to go. So it's usually not too big of an issue.
I'm so glad you distinguished correct exercise versus corrective. I could not agree more with that. So I've noticed on your Instagram page, at least, and you definitely inspired me to try out the tidal tank, different types of ways of perturbing weight, whether that's the tidal tank using sand, using kettlebells. Can you talk a little bit about that and how you use that with your athletes?
Yeah, no, I think there's so many cool forms of training out there. The list of things that we can do as trainers and even athletes who are doing the exercises is almost endless. I mean, it's so cool. I mean, there's so much variety you can use. With that said, it's important that we don't deviate too far from the foundational things that are so important. Which I always like to say, 80% of everything we do, 80% of everything I do with my athletes, with myself, is pretty foundational. It's pretty basic. It's on the basic movement patterns. It's not too crazy. And then the other 20%, that's where I like to get kind of crazy and use a lot of unique stimuli and a lot of kind of novel exercises that might challenge the nervous system and force it to maybe turn on a little bit differently, or maybe recruit muscle fibers or motor units that they normally would not have had to call upon, and some of those survival fibers that maybe we force to wake up, or maybe some of those unique exercises might expose some deviations or muscle dysfunction that we may have not previously seen when we were doing more traditional exercises. So, from the tidal tank, which is a form of oscillating kinetic energy or fluid movement, where we have the water that's moving around fluidly, or the hanging band technique, which is a similar type of oscillating kinetic energy. And all that means, it's just fancy terminology for kind of saying there's unpredictable perturbations or movements or oscillations with the weights. They bounce up and down, back and forth and side to side. So it's three-dimensional instability, and it's like I said, oftentimes unpredictable. So our nervous system has to be very highly engaged and turned on and prepared to handle whatever force or force vector is coming through it. And oftentimes that requires us to maintain very, very high levels of intramuscular tension. And ironically, those high levels of intramuscular tension have been shown to maximize proprioceptive feedback, or our sense of feel. So this kind of goes back to this whole range of motion thing, where if we lose, or let's put it this way, if we want to go to a maximal range of motion, just this huge range of motion, guess what we have to do? We actually have to release too much muscle tension. We have to sacrifice muscle stiffness. Well, that muscle stiffness is important for proprioception, like I said, or sense of feel. So when we use these maximal ranges of motion, or these excessive ranges of motion, guess what? We're actually degrading our proprioception, our sensory feedback, and our kinesthetic awareness. When we stay real tight and lock our movements in and have high levels of muscular tension, that actually is what gives us that optimal sense of feel and proprioception. Again, that's around those 90-degree angles. So it's all the science kind of coincides. It's not just like, oh, well, sometimes we want to stay, in those 90-degree angles, and other times we want to go through these massive ranges of motion. It's like, no, the biomechanics, the neurophysiology, the structural physiology, the functional anatomy, it kind of all says the same thing. It's all congruent. So back to your initial question, though, all those forms of training that I do, those never replace the basics. And in fact, we have to master the basics, master the foundational movements before we actually earn the right to do some of the crazy exercises. Otherwise, we're just doing them wrong.
I love that you said earn the right to do those exercises. I think that's a really good point. Speaking of sensory proprioception, on your website, I read an article and saw some pictures of people that had bandanas wrapped around their eyes. And I thought they're either wearing their mask weirdly, or they are dressing up as bandits for Halloween. I couldn't exactly tell what was going on. And it turns out you were trying to limit their eyesight. Can you explain how that plays into that proprioception?
Yeah, no, they were training for the new upcoming Zorro movie.
They look good.
Yeah, no, that's hilarious. No, that's a great question. I love, but this whole, everything we're talking about is cool because it all kind of feeds back into this this whole thought process of how do we optimize our body mechanics so that we can maximize our performance and our overall physiological function. So the eyes closed training, it's taking basically that proprioceptive feedback and taking it a step further. So we have several ways that we use our sense of proprioception when we're doing movement, or our senses, and that's mainly through our vision, it's through our muscle proprioception, and it's through our equilibrium, through our inner ear. And there's not a lot we can do some things to mess with the equilibrium and inner ear, but I don't go there too much. Usually it's altering the visual stimulus or the muscular stimulus. And when we eliminate one of those, elements, or one of those forms of proprioception and feedback, it forces the other to work harder. So if we eliminate the visual system, okay, it forces our muscular proprioception to work harder. So our muscles have to work harder to stabilize. They have to work harder to control the movement. And we have to have an even greater sense of feel, and any deviations in form we get punished more severely for, and they become exponentially magnified because you can't rely on that other system of balance. We have to basically use only our muscles to control the weight. And so it oftentimes immediately exposes some pretty substantial flaws in movement, some deviations, some asymmetries, some misalignment, and the person is forced to essentially start correcting those almost within seconds. Otherwise, they can't control the exercise. And so that eyes closed combined with the eccentric isometric. So again, going slow, feeling those 90-degree stretch positions with the eyes closed, you get so much sensory feedback. And then, it's up to the client to start tuning into that sensory feedback so that they can fine tune and master their movement, so that we as coaches aren't constantly telling them, hey, well, adjust this or pull your leg in or go deeper, adjust your foot here. It's like, no, they can start to feel those things and we don't have to keep pointing it out. And then they become the masters of their own movement and they become their own coaches. And that's what it's all about, not relying on these constant external cues, but relying on those internal cues and that inherent feedback that our body is capable of giving us. We just have to know how to tune into it. And the eyes closed and the eccentric isometrics, that's what that's for.
Wow. I had another great personal trainer once take me through this exercise where we would go into an open room and he would blindfold me and then put on noise canceling headphones. And you are supposed to march in place and you better hope that it's a big room and not a lot of things on the ground because you end up in a completely different area in the room that you're in. When you take away that proprioception, it's amazing how you lose that sense and for the trained eye, they can find those movement imbalances.
Yeah. Wow. That's wild. That's pretty cool. I like that. I may have to add something like that in. That, like you said, kind of having that lack of visual orientation, not just, it's one thing to close your eyes. And I actually posted some things on this and you may have seen this in the article. I'll have people turn in the room with their eyes closed or, blindfolded. And even the reason for that is because even when we close our eyes, when we're straight in a room, we still have that last snapshot that we took of our surroundings and we're constantly referencing it, whether we realize it or not, even when our eyes are closed. And so what I like to do is oftentimes have the individual turn slightly and then close their eyes, or they can close their eyes, then turn. And what ends up happening is you have no reference point for what is straight. You have no reference point for what is a straight line, where am I? You have to go purely by sense of feel. And our vision and our visual system is oftentimes it's very misleading because we have ocular dominance or we favor one eye or we have one side that we favor. And so if we try to use what we perceive as straight lines to line up our human movement, it oftentimes ends up being misaligned. Whereas if we eliminate that kind of visual, those visual kind of miscues, and we go purely by sense of feel, we actually have better body mechanics. It's oftentimes disorienting at first, but it's pretty cool to see people use that to improve their movement quality.
That's a great point. Let's take a quick break and come back and have our final segment.
Awesome.
This has become probably our favorite portion of our podcast to go over with our guests. 3 questions. The first one, what is one thing you've learned or changed your mind about in the last week?
Oh, interesting. One thing I've changed my mind about. This is tough. I would say maybe just learning a little bit more about coiling movements or rotational movements. Not so much changing my mind, but just seeing kind of what's out there in the fitness industry and what other people are doing. Just kind of trying to learn more about that. I've seen some different things. I ran into the WEC method. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that. So people send it to me. So I've just been trying to learn more about that to kind of see where these individuals are coming from. And so it's different. I'm kind of curious to learn more about that. So
love it. Always got to be learning. What is one thing you wish you would have done better in the last week or in the recent future or recent past?
Oh man, definitely more sleep. I need to get more sleep. My schedule is so crazy. I always harp on my clients for not getting enough sleep, but that's my worst thing. I need to improve that. I've become kind of efficient at not getting enough sleep. That's probably not so good.
We're getting that response a lot.
Yeah. Interesting. I'm not surprised.
And finally, what is one thing you're really proud of in the last week?
One thing I'm proud of. I think probably just helping. I actually had a few new people this week, some new athletes. And I would say I get new people every few weeks, but for some reason this week I had a few new athletes and I was able to kind of help them with some things that they were dealing with within that just first few sessions, kind of overcome some issues that they were dealing with their feet and with their knees and some of their misalignment, and they could start to feel it almost immediately. And so that was cool just to see kind of that immediate, positive feedback. And then just, trying to touch different people's lives. I try to share my faith and share what I believe about, kind of we're here for a purpose, and kind of to trust God with everything. And that can kind of help take stress off of life, because if we're trying to do everything ourselves and we don't believe in a higher power, it can become a little overwhelming. So I try to reach people not just at the physical level, but sometimes at the spiritual and emotional and psychological level as well.
That's really powerful. I think that's such an important part, especially of a coach. So I would like to touch on advanced human performance, how people can learn more about you, what you offer as far as online counseling, training, that kind of thing.
Yeah. So I got my website, advancedhumanperformance.com. I'm in the Atlanta, Georgia area. I do a lot of stuff one-on-one with pretty much every population, from pro athletes, college athletes, high school athletes, as well as general population, elderly, adolescents. Do a lot of things with people who have struggled with injuries that they weren't able to overcome with other forms of training. I do a lot of online stuff too. I have online clients in Australia, in Thailand, actually. It keeps me busy. So, and I have a lot of articles on there too. So they want to read more about some of the training methods, the eccentric, isometrics, the eyes closed. Then I have my book if they want to learn even more and kind of see the research that I went through. It took me 8 years to write. The book is Movement Redefined. It just kind of jam-packed with all the information I learned. I tried to just pretty much throw it all out there so that the reader could see everything that I found, and here's how I came to my conclusions, and then they can kind of do with it as they want, but it's all there. So
No wonder you're having an issue with sleep. When do you sleep?
yeah, my sleep is great. I just don't sleep enough. Yeah, I know I probably, I need to be getting more than 5 hours a night. If I can get 6 or 7 a night, I'm good. But lately it's been a lot less than that. So I know it's too busy. I need to find that balance, right?
Well, you have an amazing website. You're prolific with your content. There's so much there. Before we close out, what is one thing you would like somebody to take away from this conversation and plug into their life?
I think just to learn to think for yourself. Just because the majority is doing it, just because an industry is pushing a certain idea or everyone around you is pushing a certain idea, don't let that be the guiding light that just kind of, oh, well, I'm going to do this because everyone is doing it, or everyone says this is right, so this is what I'm going to do. I think the more we learn to think for ourselves, the more we learn to examine why we have the beliefs that we do, whether it's about anything, life, exercise, science, religion. The more we can dive deeper and try to analyze it and kind of examine and go on this journey and see and explore. And this is a lot of my methods kind of came from that. I didn't just listen to what I was being told or what other coaches were doing. I had to kind of go back to the drawing board with a clean slate, look at the science for myself without all these outside voices, and come to my own conclusions. And I think the more we do that individually, I think the better everyone's going to be.
Wow. I think we should end it there. I don't know if we could finish that any
I
better.
could only talk to you for like 12 more hours about this kind of stuff.
This has been fantastic. I've certainly learned a lot. I think our listeners will learn a lot. Thank you so much, Dr. Joel Seedman, for taking the time. We're very grateful for you and for your content and your work and for talking to us today.
Yeah, thank
My
you.
pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks
Thank
so much
you.
for having me. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Boundless Body Radio. We'll talk to you soon.